If you read the description of my channel, then you'll notice that I created it not just for apologetic purposes, but also for in-house debates among Christians. Now, although I have touched upon some of these issues like dinosaurs and divine council theology, I've spent most of my time in research on things like the resurrection and the reliability of the New Testament, things that are more apologetic than in-house debates. So I decided to shake things up a bit and dedicate a series towards perhaps the most hotly debated topic among Christians, Genesis. Now, I want to be clear from the outset that I consider this a secondary issue. I don't think people who disagree with my conclusions are heretics who are brainwashed fools. Now, unfortunately, it seems that many Christians place your interpretation of Genesis as just as important for a Christian as the affirmation of the resurrection, the Trinity, and the inspiration of Scripture. But the fact of the matter is that this is a relatively new idea. When the early church fathers such as Irenaeus or Athanasius were arguing against the heretics, the topic of one's interpretation of Genesis never came up. Now, to bring this sort of long-winded introduction to an end, I want to be completely transparent that I believe evolution is true and is not at odds with the Bible. Now, I know that may seem crazy for some, but that's the truth about what I believe. And lest anyone think that I'm just trying to conform modern science with the Bible, I will also say that I think the Bible contains a flat earth, a solid sky dome, and a watery chaos dragon. Yet, I don't find these facts problematic with their relation to modern science. Now, I know I'm probably evil for dropping something like that out of nowhere and just not elaborating, but I believe it's important for understanding my approach to Genesis, and it is something I hope to discuss further later on in this channel. But until then, this will have to suffice. Now, you may have heard from a skeptic that the Bible copies various myths, and one of the most blatant examples is the creation story. The idea of God's creating the universe in 7 days is common in the ancient world, and is most definitely a connection that Genesis 1 has to these other stories. But I, and many others, don't see this as plagiarism. There are various ancient Near Eastern motifs, and the 7-day creation is one of them. I don't think Genesis is copying ancient Near Eastern writings, I think it is an ancient Near Eastern writing. But you see, I think there is a reason for this. Genesis has some parts that are the same as these other myths, and others that are wildly different. Why is that? Well, it's my contention, and that of many other scholars, that Genesis 1 is partly a polemic against the other nations and their gods. Now, this may make the average Christian queasy that Genesis shares things in common with other ancient Near Eastern myths, and doesn't present an accurate scientific understanding of the origins of the universe. But I don't think it should be. I think the Christian Old Testament scholar Dr. Ben Stanhope put it best when he said, "How would it even be coherent for the Genesis author to go about discrediting the myths of the nations by producing an account chronologically commensurate with science that would only be discovered thousands of years later?" The overall point is that Genesis takes elements of these false myths because they were widely known as undisputed fact, and then either rejects them fully or corrects them on their understanding of these things. My intention is to go basically verse by verse in Genesis 1 to show what I mean. Genesis begins similar to other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, with the original state of the earth being watery chaos. In Genesis chapter 1 verses 9 and 10, dry land emerges out of the waters. In all 4 major versions of our Egyptian cosmology texts, we have creation emerging from the primeval waters, and many other cultures are the same in this respect. The first major divergence is the way in which the gods, or God, creates the world. Egyptian mythology had a watery chaos dragon named Apithys, which had to be defeated by the sun god and his helpers every morning. Among the Babylonians, we see the initial state of watery chaos personified in the reptilian dragon of chaos, Tiamat, whom Marduk must defeat to create the world. The ancient Near Eastern motif about a god waging battle with the marine chaos dragon is also explicitly attributed to Israel's God in passages like Psalm 74 and the form of the Hebrew version of this creature, Leviathan, which I have talked about previously on this channel. What is most interesting in the case of Genesis is the absence of this event. Not only does God not struggle with any watery chaos dragon, but it seems the reverse may have occurred. In verse 21, God creates the great sea monsters in conjunction with other sea creatures. The Hebrew term used for these monsters is Tannin. Tannin was a generic term for the chaos monsters of Ugaritic culture, used interchangeably with the dragon Litnu or Yam. In the Bible, this word is used in the same manner for the Leviathan. The author of Genesis 1:21 is directly playing off of this connotation to polemically imply that the sea monster, which was so greatly feared and so powerful, is depicted as no more than a sea creature that God made. In Psalm 104, it explicitly says that God created Leviathan to play in the ocean. The Genesis creation story is meant to show the absolute sovereignty and power of God above all creation. Now, another major part of every creation story in the ancient Near East was the creation of the firmament. It is found in Sumerian, Babylonian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Phoenician literature. Now, although I hope to dive deeper into the firmament and ancient Near Eastern cosmology in the future, I don't really have the time for the purposes of this video, and a brief explanation will have to work. In the ancient Near East, the idea that the initial state of the universe was just water, and that later the gods or God created dry land and created a solid sky dome to hold back the waters from above, was undisputed, despite how odd it may seem to a modern audience. This was something that virtually everyone believed. The ancient Near Eastern Israelites were no exception either, as they thought the same. But there's one remarkable difference. Just like God didn't have to battle a chaos dragon to create the world in Genesis, he also didn't have to use any effort to create the firmament. He just simply speaks and it is made, which is much different from the other ancient Near Eastern writings about how God makes the firmament and these works. Now, if you read the Genesis account, you'll notice that light is created before the sun. Many young earthers will argue that the light from days 1, 2, and 3 came from God himself to get around this issue. Now, I think both many young and old earth interpretations of Genesis typically end up stretching things a bit, but I sort of agree with the young earthers here. This idea does have some sort of backing in passages such as Isaiah chapter 60 verse 19 and Psalm chapter 104 verse 2. The only difference is our interpretation on why this is. If you're still here, then you probably know that I think this is a polemic. In the opening of the Babylonian creation story, we read of Marduk wearing the sunlight and the aurora of 10 gods on his own body. In the Egyptian god Atum, he emerges into existence from primordial waters and declares that he lightens darkness. What's most interesting is it's not until later in the account that the sun is formally created. The creation of mankind also follows the path of the typical ancient Near Eastern understanding of the creation of man, but as we'll see, there are some very noticeable differences. In Genesis, man, or Adam, is made from the dust of the ground. The Sumerians believe that mankind was created from clay by the god Enki. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess Aruru, which I hope I'm pronouncing right, creates Enkidu out of the clay. In the Assyrian Atrahasis, the gods mix the blood of Ea with clay to make humans. In the Ugaritic text, it doesn't explicitly say how mankind was made, but we may catch a glimpse of what they thought in a passage where the god El shapes a female healing figure out of clay. So, as far as it seems, they all follow a similar pattern of God or the gods creating man from dust, clay, or some other earthly substance from the ground. But now we may get into the differences. When God creates humans in Genesis 1:26, it says, "Let us make man in our own image, as our likeness." Now, most Christians understand this plurality as a reference to the Trinity, but I don't think this is the case, as it has ancient Near Eastern parallels in various cultures, a popular one being Babylonia. In the Babylonian text, it says, "Let us slay lamb gods, with their blood, let us create mankind." The group in reference here is God's divine council, which I talked about in the video titled "Does Psalm 82 Teach Polytheism?" The primary difference is that in Genesis, when God actually goes and creates humanity, the act is accomplished with singular verbs, letting you know that this isn't the act of some angel, but actually God himself. Man's role in relation to God is also very different. In the Assyrian Atrahasis, man was made to serve the gods, working in the fields and doing manual labor for them. But Genesis turns this idea around and has God make man in his own image. But what exactly does the image of God really mean? Well, oddly enough, many Christians seem to have an odd idea that is in Mormonism, that the image of God means that we physically look like God. But this isn't what the text says, and if anything, the Bible tries to stress the large differences between God and man. Dr. Michael Heiser notes that the Hebrew syntax in Genesis 1:26-27 more likely is understood as verb-dominated. The idea is that God is calling us to image him. Heiser also states, "If we think of imaging as a verb or function, this translation makes sense. We are created to image God, to be his imagers. It is what we are by definition. The image is not an ability we have, but a status. We are God's representatives on earth. To be human is to image God." Now, in the ancient Near East, it was the king who was seen as elevated above the rest of humanity to function as the image of the gods, whereas everyone else was below them. But this is patently different in the Genesis text. Dr. J. Richard Middleton states, When the clues within the Genesis text are taken together with comparative studies in the ancient Near East, they lead to what could call a functional or even missional interpretation of the image of God in Genesis 1:26-27. On this reading, the image of God designates the royal office or calling of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world, granted authorized power to share in God's rule or administration of the earth's resources or creatures. But in my opinion, the biggest and most important polemic is that of the temple in Genesis. Now, at first it may seem odd to posit that Genesis is connected to temples. After all, there doesn't seem to be any apparent connections, and I thought the same when I first started diving deep into these subjects. There are many ideas and theories that I thought were interesting and seemed to have plausibility, but as time went on, I found out that the evidence for them just wasn't that good. Whereas the idea of Genesis being connected to temple literature was something that I thought was ridiculous when I first heard it, but as the evidence piled up, I began to think that there actually might have something to go with it. Now, I assure you that there are a lot of reasons to think that they are connected, but I think the starting point for showing this is actually related to symbolic numbers, specifically lucky number 7. There are many numbers within the biblical text that carry some sort of symbolic meaning, and 7 is one of the most famous. I will first point out how the number 7 is connected to the temple. The Tabernacle, which was not exactly the temple, but was an earlier stage of what would essentially be God's dwelling place, was completed in 7 stages. The ordination of a priest was in 7 days, the Temple of Solomon was constructed in 7 years, the temple was dedicated to God in a 7-day festival on the 7th month, and Solomon's dedication speech was given in 7 petitions. So, as you can see, the number 7 is a big part of temple literature within the Bible. Now, we can observe how it is also used relating to creation. In Hebrew, Genesis 1:1 contains 7 words. 1:2 has 14 words, a multiple of 7, and the word God occurs 35 times, a multiple of 7. In the 7-day account, the term heaven occurs 21 times, and the earth 21 times, both multiples of 7. The phrase, and it was so, and God saw it was good, occurs 7 times. The words light and day appear 7 times in the first natural paragraph, and the section about the creation of animals, the Hebrew word for living beings, appears 7 times. In the 7th paragraph, which concerns the 7th day, there occur 3 consecutive sentences that each contain 7 words, and the phrase, the 7th day, is in the center. The Hebrew word in the 7th paragraph total 35, which is a multiple of 7. Anyone who thinks there are no connections to the number 7 in Genesis or temples are just only fooling themselves. I think given this, it's rather obvious that the author of Genesis was intentionally using the number 7. But I assure you the number 7 isn't the only connecting line, for if it was, then this would still be a pretty weak theory. There are tons of connections between creation/Eden and the temple/tabernacle. The Hebrew verb used to say that God would walk in the Garden of Eden is also used of God walking about in the tabernacle. Adam and Eve were told to work and keep the garden. These same Hebrew terms are only used elsewhere to describe the job obligations of the priest who kept the tabernacle and later on the temple. In Genesis 2:2, it says God finished the work, and Exodus 40:33 says when Moses had finished the work. Genesis 2:3 says after the completion of creation God blessed the 7th day, and after the completion of the tabernacle in Exodus 39:43, it says Moses blessed them. After the blessing in Genesis 2:3, God sanctifies creation, and in Exodus 49, Moses sanctifies the tabernacle and all its furnishings. But perhaps one of the most blatant example connections to the creation/Eden and the temple has to do with the temple's portrayal of themselves. The Temple of Solomon conveyed to its visitors a sort of typological Garden of Eden. There are various connections between Eden and the tabernacle. The tabernacle was to be a copy of the pattern shown to Moses on God's holy mountain. The lampstand was fashioned in the appearance of a tree and was stationed directly outside the Holy of Holies. The cherubim inside the Holy of Holies are a clear connection to the cherubim at the entrance to Eden, and Eden was from the east, as was the way one would enter the tabernacle and later the temple. The temple also has various Edenic connections. The temple's architecture has carvings of flowers, palm trees, gourds, cypress trees, cherubim, lions, and pomegranates. In Ezekiel's vision of the new temple, he saw a temple on a high mountain, whose courts were decorated with palm trees. The interior was decorated with more palm trees, and the temple garden was well watered, with a river that gave life to everything. Psalm chapter 78 verse 69 also connects the temple imagery with creation, as it says that God built his sanctuary like the heavens, like the earth, which he has established forever. Just like every other polemic we've seen thus far, there are also other ancient Near Eastern parallels. The 7-day temple dedication shows up in Sumerian literature from over 4,000 years ago. In the Gedea Cylinder B, there's an extensive detail of a dedication festival of 7 days for a temple, and, like Genesis, the earthly temple is associated with creation itself in the text. Baal was said to have completed his house on top of the cosmic mountain in 7 days according to the Ugaritic text. But one still may wonder, in light of all this, why is there any connection between the two in the first place? And that's pretty simple. The temple is where God, or the gods, lived in the ancient world. It was a special building dedicated to them where they would dwell. The Genesis text is setting up the entire universe as the place which God can dwell. This is why God rests on the seventh day, not just because of the meaning of the number 7, but because God is meant to rest in the temple, which in this case is the entire cosmos. The text clearly states themes and motifs common in the ancient Near East, and uses them to show that the God of Israel, Yahweh, is sovereign above all these things, and is the true God. And if one doesn't think the text was very thought out and put in a certain way, then look no further than the days of creation themselves, and see how they parallel each other. On day 1, God creates light. On day 4, God makes the sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, God separates the waters above from the waters below via the firmament. And on day 5, God creates the creatures which dwell in the waters below and the seas, and the birds that fly near the waters above in the sky. On day 3, God creates dry land and vegetation. And on day 6, God creates the land creatures which dwell there. This all comes to a conclusion with God taking up his residence in the temple on the 7th day and resting. And with all that, this video is over. This is by far the one that I put in the most effort and research, so I hope everyone enjoyed it. And if you want to see more, feel free to subscribe. If you like the video, then leave a like. And if you have any questions or have any ideas for future videos, leave a comment. With that being said, I hope to make more videos regarding Genesis, and I might have 1 or 2 more videos regarding New Testament reliability. With that being said, thank you for watching.